Hi friend. 3.14 ways for DIY DJs and music producers to make cool audio visualizers like this.
Like, whoa.
Cool, right? Stick around. I'm going to show you how to activate your music for animating any object, visualize the audio spectrum of your music, visualize the audio waveform of your music, and I'll walk you through examples of 5 cool effects I think make the most sense for music producers, including the final renderings of the one you just saw. Let's jump into Adobe After Effects, where we're going to take a look at a split effect, which will make my trusty assistant Yobot Squint here look like it has a mouth that moves. Then we'll take a look at Scatterize, which breaks it into a bunch of particles. We'll take a look at Mercury, which will make it look like a bunch of mercury liquid kind of floating around its head. Then we'll take a look at Ball Action, which is kind of similar to Scatterize, but it actually, if you look really close, there's a bunch of tiny little balls. And then Pixel Poly, which you saw in the little clip in the intro. But brah, what about the music? Now, before any of this will work at all, the part you came for is, how do I get it to go to music? How do I get it to make motion, do whatever it is that I want it to do, but do it to music? There are 2 ways in Adobe After Effects that work really well for this and are pretty automatic. The first is you're going to, you basically create a layer that uses the audio amplitude function. And so if I have an audio file, for example, this is the audio file that you've been hearing in the clips, and I go to Keyframe Assistant and then convert audio to keyframe, then it will create all the keyframes that it interpolates to the waveform of the audio. So this is a good example where the waveform is underneath and Premiere has created all of these keyframes. So if you're used to doing automation in a DAW, specifically Ableton Live, you'll see all these different data points, and just think of that like automation, except you didn't have to do any of it, which you can appreciate the beauty in that. That's beautiful, man. The second way you can get things to respond to audio in After Effects is not so much getting things to respond like the first method, but it is creating a spectrum visualizer or a waveform visualizer. So there are 2 effects, and I'll switch over to this layer that I have. There are 2 effects that can do this. In this scenario, I used the audio spectrum effect, and there is another one called the waveform or audio waveform effect, and it will produce very similar results, but based on the waveform rather than the spectrum. The easiest way to see what this thing does is to just move the transport around. I'll go ahead and run the audio for a second, and you can hear it as well. Okay, so you get an idea from that. While that was playing, I switched over here to the Spectrum Visualizer layer and then exposed the effect controls for it. And you can see there's a whole bunch of parameters that you can apply. And the only one I'm going to talk about right now is when you create this layer and apply this effect, by default, it will do nothing. And the reason for that is because there's this drop down where you have to tell it what to react to. And so you can see that I have previously set it to react to this MP3 file, which is a song that you're hearing. But what about the waveforms? Moving on, as I mentioned, that was the spectrum visualizer. There's also a waveform visualizer, and I don't have that set up here, but it would essentially work the same. You just go to the effects, find that waveform effect instead, and you drag it onto the layer. You have to assign you have to assign it to the song in the same way, and then what it does is it basically does the same types of functionalities for the most part, except related and displaying the waveform like a more traditional audio waveform you would see in a DAW, rather than the spectrum which you would see, for example, in Ableton Live's spectrum device or span or something like that. Cool. But could you hit me with that one more time? Okay, so those are the two ways that you can get audio to cause things to happen in After Effects, for lack of a better word. The first one, which was all the keyframing, that will allow you to then map that keyframing to any object that you would like to. And the second that I showed, which was the spectrum or the waveform visualizer, that will actually interpret the waveform or the spectrum of the audio into a line or a solid or whatever. In my case, this kind of looks like an hourglass or one of those hot lava deals. Bruh, lava. Got it. The spectrum and waveform are super cool, and they're configurable, but they do what they do. Where the real beef happens here is with this audio amplitude piece that we talked about, because what you can do with this is anything that you put in here can then be affected by this keyframe mapping. And this is really powerful because in After Effects, for example, anytime you apply an effect to an item, and I'll turn on this layer, so it's that black version of Squint there, all of these items that have a little stopwatch next to them are basically items that are eligible for keyframing, which means all of this kind of stuff. So if that exists, then what it means is you could map all of this to that. So in this case, since this was the audio amplitude keyframe, if you expand the effects, what you'll see is it's got this slider. And this slider is kind of a representation of all of these keyframes and the amplitude, like this range. You could see a 40 here and then down to 0. So it's kind of like it's mapped to that. And so what happens is if you find some attribute of one of these objects that you want to automate, you essentially drag this little pick whip deal over to whatever it is you want to automate, and then you let it go. And then essentially like an envelope follower in Ableton Live or mapping LFOs and that kind of thing, you're basically using this keyframe-based amplitude mapping to affect attributes of images that you put into After Effects. Dude, I've been wondering what all those dots were for like 7 minutes. If the light came on there, what you realize is you could take any of hundreds of effects in After Effects and essentially automate any of the attributes to your music. Okay? And then not only that, but you've got complete control over modifying anything that you don't like the way it reacts. You can set ranges through expressions. There's an insane amount of control over what you probably have time for, to be honest, if you're trying to spend more time in Ableton. Ableton, in this scenario, which will run it, I had mapped the little pick whip. I had matched it over here to scale, okay? And I already did it, but if I hit play now, you'll see that Squint there is bouncing around to all of these, and it's because I mapped from the slider, which is the amplitude of all this, and I mapped it to the scale. That's all I did. Yo, man, how about a little color? Let's move on to the next effect. So we're going to leave the spectrum visualizer on. We're going to leave the audio amplitude keyframes on. And then we've already got the main image, this black image here, right? And so I just have that back there as a base. I could actually go to the next effect, which is split, and it's just a blue version of squint. And you can actually see now that there's a little split right where maybe a mouth might be. And so I had the black there to just maybe show that a little bit better. Again, if I move the transport, you can see now there's a split at the mouth, and it gets bigger in some places and really looks pretty cool if, you know, like if you run it in one of those dramatic sections. Yeah, so kind of fun. You could put that on a photo of yourself or whatever. But dude, what about all that cool stuff flying everywhere? Let's take a look at Scatterize. This is pretty cool. So I'm going to turn off that blue layer that was split. And I'm also going to expand that audio amplitude layer, just as a reminder that that's where all the automation is coming from. And then, so split is off. We'll turn on Scatterize, and I made that green. And let's just a little bit on the transport, and then I'll go ahead and run it. To the city like whoa. All right, so you can see I basically chopped this thing up into a bunch of pieces, and then now those pieces are kind of splitting apart and spreading apart in the same way that it did for just the basic black and the same kind of motion. Bro, you know anything about Liquid House? Cool, so that was Scatterize, and we're going to turn that off. You're going to see our black image again, and then I will turn on the next one, which is Mr. Mercury or Mercury, and you can already see that it's yellow and it has applied this kind of mercurial liquidy effect here. With a 2D image like mine, it won't look near as cool, but it actually still looks pretty cool. I guess you just don't know the difference actually, but I saw it applied with some much more textural type of images, and it definitely shines in those areas, but I still think it looks cool. We'll run it a little bit here. To the city like whoa. Yeah, so you can see it almost looks a little bit like fire and whatnot. And again, there's a gazillion controls. You can apply the automation from the audio amplitude, the keyframing. You could apply it to any of those things. So just playing around and seeing what works for you. Yo, cuz I'm getting ready to bounce. Rave on, friends. Mercury is in retrograde. Let's turn that off. Done with Mercury and move on to ball action. That is the first time I've been able to say that without laughing. Kind of like fart joke. Let's expand that, and you can see that I've mapped the slider from the amplitude keyframing over to scatter. And if I very slowly just kind of frame at a time, you can see all these little balls are all going outside of the perimeter of the object of squint, and it's going to look kind of similar to scatter, and it depends on all the settings that you do, but still pretty cool. To the city like whoa. So really, although it looks similar, once you get into all the different controls and configurations, you can have different behavior for the balls versus the kind of behavior that you had in the Scatterize attributes. So yeah, good one to check out. Dude. And the fifth and final effect is pixel poly. And that's the one you saw in the initial clip. So let's turn off ball action and not laugh about it. And then let's turn on pixel poly. And this is the main reason I had the black one in the background initially, was to get this to just look cooler once it flew apart. So you can see what's going on. I'm going back on the transport, right? So we'll take a look at that from the very beginning.
City like whoa.
All right, so in that one, I've expanded over here all of the attributes, and you can see that I don't have anything mapped to the Amplitude keyframes. But what I did do is I went in here to, if you recall when we first talked about the keyframing, initially they were all about the same height because it's effectively the same audio throughout this 35-second piece. So I highlighted these and lowered them up to a certain marker point, and then the lighter kick drum kicks in. So I highlighted those keyframes and pulled them down to like the 20 range. So I basically got a 10 threshold, a 20 threshold, and then whatever was left original. And so that is what's actually triggering that explosion, is based on, it's set to just a hard amplitude number to everything to break apart. And then I adjusted some settings to get it to break away the way I wanted it to in terms of gravity and number of pieces and the way they spin and all that kind of stuff. So you can adjust all of that. And this was the one I ultimately wanted to use for this particular song. So I took it kind of the furthest in terms of thinking about storyboarding it and what I might be able to do for a final visualizer rendering for this one. Yo, friend, we made it to the end. Now I'm going to play all 5 rendered in high resolution.
Coming to your city like whoa. Coming to your city like coming to your city like whoa.
Hip hop, that's Wes Smith, you.